Okay, so I'm going to talk today about the Great Tacoma Speedway. Um, I had no idea this existed a couple of years ago, and I was researching racing in Tacoma and stumbled across the Great Tacoma Speedway and it's all of its glory. So I've taken what I learned a couple of years ago and added to it, found some more stories, found some stories that I thought were true that maybe aren't. And we can talk about some of that as we go along. So, find my spot. What city do you think about race? When you think about racing in America, what do you think about? Indianapolis or Detroit, maybe Daytona, but do you ever think about Tacoma? Every day, Pierce County drivers pass along part of a grand racetrack. Well, it was once a grand racetrack, and they really don't even know it. Tacoma Speedway operated between 1912 and 1922, 10 years, on a track that looped through what is now Lakewood's commercial center. It all started in 1912 with the Montamara Festo. The Festo was a thing put on by the Tacoma Carnival Association to promote the town. And most of it took place at Stadium High School in the bowl there. There were vaudeville acts and fireworks. And here's the official program for the Montamara Festo. And you can see down at the bottom, at the very bottom, they've tacked on "and automobile races." Arthur Pritchard, the Tacoma Automobile Club, decided they wanted to promote automobiling in the area. And to do that, they brought some of the top racers in the country to Tacoma. And they tacked racing onto the end of this festival at the 4th of July, with racing going on July 5th and 6th. Here's one of the postcards to promote the Festo in Tacoma. You can see Tacoma's got this long affiliation with Tigers that goes way back. And the Tigers are celebrating. And when you can't go, you get sad and cry about it there on the bottom. 1912, the speedway at Tacoma wasn't a speedway, it was a connection of roads. It was 5 miles on dirt roads, some of them county roads. The grandstand was, and the start finish were on what's now Lakeview Avenue. So you run north on Lakeview, make a sharp left-hand turn onto Steilacoom Boulevard, a gradual left onto Gravelly Lake, and it's Gravelly Lake still follows that curve to the west side, runs down Gravelly Lake and turns left again, 90-degree left on 112th, and comes back over to Lakeview Avenue. And that was the 5-mile track, a road course on dirt roads around Lakewood. Here's the start of the Montamara Festo races in 1912. You can see the cars on that fine county road, nothing but dirt. There's a ditch on the inside. And in fact, at least one car went into the ditch at speed. It was a pretty exciting way to travel. They ran 250-mile sprint races and a 200-mile race, and then the 250-mile Montamarathon. All 4 races were part of the national championship, which was sponsored by AAA. 50,000 spectators came, and the ferries were plugged, the trains were loaded, and people were parking everywhere. They even ran special trains from Portland to bring people up to the races. The first race winners were Eddie Pullen and Huey Hughes in a Mercer race event. They went 150 miles at an average speed of 62 miles an hour. That's 62 miles an hour on dirt. And this was Eddie Pullen's first win for the national championship. Pullen and Hughes both worked for Mercer. Let me back up one. They both worked for Mercer. Hughes was a mechanic, and Pullen was one of the engineers in their tool factory or tool design facility, building tools to make Mercer cars. It's a pretty interesting little car. You see the tank behind the driver and the mechanician, basically the riding mechanic. The tank is two tanks, one for gas and one for water, one for oil. You need two tanks because the engine loses a lot of oil as you race. And there's, to pressurize the tanks, there are pumps. You see them under Eddie Pullen's elbow. The driver has two pumps. The riding mechanic has two pumps. While the driver is keeping this thing on course, going 62 miles an hour on a dirt road, the mechanic has a job of keeping the pressure pumped up for the gas and the oil. Here's a picture of Jay Leno's Mercer Raceabout, still in existence in California now. It was made in Trenton, New Jersey. Lots of them were painted yellow and black. It just happened to be the colors for Trenton's favorite school, Princeton University. A lot of the Mercer Raceabouts were sold to wealthy university students at Princeton. It was famed for its lightweight chassis and the small engine, only 293 cubic inch bore. Basically a 5-liter engine that produced about 55 horsepower. The top speed was a little over 90, but it handled really well. That was really the key to Mercer's racing, was it handled so well. It was low and very lightweight for its day. In the 250-mile race, the winner was driving quite a different car. This is Teddy Tetzlaff, a Californian, driving a Fiat S74 with a massive 589 cubic inch four-cylinder. I mean, we're talking almost 10 liters now. Single overhead cam, 4 valves per cylinder, 2 plugs, and his average speed was 66 miles an hour. So this was quite a bit faster than the Mercer. It didn't handle as well, but in the 250-mile race, he was the winner on the 5-mile course. Tetzlaff's one of my favorite characters. He's nicknamed Terrible Teddy because he was very hard on his equipment. Teddy was famous for either crashing or blowing things up or winning. And he finished second at Indianapolis in 1912. He came to Tacoma. The legend is he was kidnapped by gangsters, and they wanted a ransom from his manager. And supposedly he was held in one of Tacoma's brothels and enjoyed the company so much, smoking the cigars, cheating at cards, and enjoying the company in the bordello. So he refused his release when he was ransomed. But I'm not sure that's true. That's the legend that people tell, but that legend never appeared until one of his cohorts wrote his autobiography in the 1960s. And in fact, if you look at the newspapers of the time, and the Tacoma Times, the Oregonian, the Seattle Star, all available online back in those days, and they're pretty interesting reads. But if you look at the press at the time, Teddy took one of the local reporters on a little test drive down the Pacific Highway at 90 miles an hour, just to show him what it would do. It must have been quite a ride. And he made a couple of runs to Seattle to promote Fiat. So he was actually pretty busy while he supposedly was kidnapped. I'm not convinced he was kidnapped, but it's a nice story. Teddy also set a world speed record going 143 miles an hour in 1914. So he had quite a great career, and he appears in several Hollywood movies, and he's a stunt driver in a lot of the silent films. In 1913, they moved the road course, shrunk it a little bit, made it a 3.5 mile course, still on dirt roads, still on the Stillicum and Gravelly Lake, but it moves basically a little west of where it was. And this is one of my favorite pictures because it's taken from the spectator stands. And it's an amazing view of not only the infield, where all people are parked right along the edge of the road to watch the race, but the people in the stands. All the gentlemen are wearing hats. All the ladies are wearing hats. I mean, it looks like they're going to the Kentucky Derby with all the fancy hats, parasols in there. People got dressed up for a day at the races, and the races were on a dirt road. So you wore your Sunday best to the races, and maybe you came back a little dirty. Here's a picture of Earl Cooper, who averaged 70 miles an hour, driving the famous Stutz number 8, driving by one of the fences along the dirt road. His Stutz Bearcat was the car to have in 1913. He won both the championship races and won the national championship that year also. In 1914, there are a series of races in addition to the big national championship event. One of the races is a race for drivers from Seattle and Tacoma and Portland called the Intercity Race, and this is the lineup for that race. Now, a lot of these vehicles will be powered by even Ford Model T engines, and it's pretty much a conglomeration of homegrown cars. They ran a 2-mile dirt track in 1914. Again, the Lakeview Stillicum area and that same kind of configuration. Here's one of the cars that entered in 1913. It's a Pacific Car Special. I can't find any sign that it was connected to Pacific Car building railroad cars, but it may have been. And it was, this is one of the pictures by Marvin Boland that's available at Tacoma Public Library. Shows a couple of Tacoma guys in their homemade car to go racing in the Intercity Race. The other thing that went on in 1914 were the cyclecar races. The drivers were all under 16. They had motorcycle engines. They went between 35 and 50 miles an hour. The drivers supposedly built and designed their own cars. I'm not sure how much of that was true. Some of the cars are pretty sophisticated, but some of them do look homemade. Basically bicycle wheels. And again, you can see the driver in this one reaching down for the pump, probably to pump up gas into the engine. The cycle cars posed on A Street for a group photo, just to show off and show the press. This is A Street in Tacoma with the streetcars in the background. This is Walter Grossman's Red Devil, one of the cars without a body. So you can see the motorcycle engine, the pump arrangement to pump gas into the engine while you're driving, chain drive, and might have been quite a thrill to go 50 miles an hour on a dirt 2-mile course in that car. In 1914, they brought in 35,000 spectators. They had 5,000 turned away from the gate. It was billed as a Stutz versus Mercer battle. Stutz and Mercer were, two companies who built similar kinds of cars and promoted them with racing. It was kind of the Camaro Mustang battle of the day. Huey Hughes, who had been a Mercer driver in Mercer riding mechanic in 1912, won the 200-mile Golden Potlatch, and Earl Cooper won the second year in a row in the Montamara Festo driving for Stutz. Here's a quote from the Washington Standard in 1914, and it goes on about the crowd being worked to a frenzy by the mad, wild, death-defying flight of the racing cars. Um, it's the kind of thing that was the way things were written in the good old days in newspapers, and you know, tire-burning efforts for supremacy and glory, and all about Earl Cooper winning again in his Stutz Ghost. Here's some Stutz advertising. This is a page out of a magazine, a Motor Print magazine in 1914. Stutz's promotion of their cars using racing. Earl Cooper. Earl Cooper is a Stutz driver. He won the Montamara Festo trophy 2 years running, 1913, 1914. He won the national championship in both in 13 or 14. And in 1913, he won 7 races and had 1 second in 8 starts. He ended up being a 5-time winner in Tacoma, and took home the Montamara Festo trophy. The trophy was maintained in Tacoma, and it was given to Earl Cooper in 1929 because nobody had any use for it anymore. Racing had ended in Tacoma. The trophy was really cool looking. It had Mount Tacoma on top and cars circling the mountain underneath. And it's now at the Indianapolis 500 Museum, given by the Cooper family. And here's the list of cars and drivers who won the championship races in Tacoma on dirt. What the fun stuff starts in 1950. In 1915, the Tacoma Speedway Association put together the money and built a board track. They put together $100,000 to build this wooden saucer. Corners were banked at 21 degrees. It's about 18 feet banking. And Tacoma's track was different from the other tracks built in the time, and it was a lattice track. That means they put the 2x4s on end instead of laying them flat side by side. So there was a gap between the 2x4s. That $100,000, if you adjusted that for inflation, that's $2.5 million today. This was a big deal in 1915. And here's a picture of Tacoma's lattice track. I have no idea what this gentleman's doing on his sidecar, but it does show the surface of the track at the start-finish line. The grandstand there was on Steilacoom Boulevard. They used 15 tons of nails, 20 penny nails, to build this track. And almost immediately, people racing on this track realized it was going to be different. Not only did you have splinters coming up from the track, but now you had gravel shooting out of it because it had been packed with gravel in between the 2x4s. To promote the track while they were constructing it, they did some really interesting things like racing cars. 4 cars ran this race against a train from Tacoma to Mount Rainier. The end of the railroad track was in Ashford, so that was the end of the course. The train and the cars took off from downtown Tacoma and raced to Ashford. The train actually won by 5 minutes. The number 2 car in this picture was driven by a woman, Mrs. Ridgway. I have no idea what her first name was, but she was Mrs. O.A.H. Ridgway in all the documentation. And she averaged 45 miles an hour between Tacoma and Ashford. And that's not bad, you know? I mean, it's you can make it a little faster, maybe average speed today, if you catch the lights right on 7th. But she did okay. She impressed the engineer so much that he gave her the prize. The bag of gold was $1,000 prize, And he gave that to Mrs. Ridgway for winning, for being the first car and only being 5 minutes behind his train. They also promoted it with this picture, which appeared in the press, called the Woman's Race. It's not a race, obviously. These are street cars, but they're pretty fancy street cars, so I like the whole legend of the women's race. The women certainly are dressed for racing. I mean, I certainly hope my grandmother would dress like that in the 1915 for racing. And the cars are amazing. I mean, you've got a Rio, you've got a Pathfinder, a Pierce Arrow, and a Chandler. Chandlers were built in Cleveland, and there was a Chandler dealer in Tacoma, believe it or not, selling cars for about 3 times what a Model T would cost. In 1915, Henry Ford built 500,000 Model Ts. Believe me, none of these manufacturers are making more than about 10,000 cars in a year, if that. Pathfinder's famous for one thing. They built cars in Indianapolis, and most of them were exported to Russia. I have no idea how they cornered that export market, but they were out of business in 1917 when World War I disrupted their supply chain. Here's the second picture from the women's race. Again, the luxury automobiles, or at least mid-class automobiles. There's not one Model T in the whole picture. Here's a wide shot that appeared in one of the newspapers in 1915 of the famous Tacoma Speedway, annually the scene of an exciting automobile race. And so it's, again, the people lined up, even though it's now a board track, people lined up on the infield. The infield was the parking area. And the stands full of people. In 1915, the Montamara Festo included a lot of different things: fireworks, aerobatics, Barney Oldfield trying to set speed records on the track. The Intercity 100 was won by Seattle's Jim Parsons. Eddie Pullen won the 200-mile Golden Potlatch, and Grover Ruckstall won the Monta Marathon. Unfortunately, one of the drivers and his co-driver, riding mechanic, were killed in a crash at this race. And here's some of the advertising from Mercer's big win. Since Pullen and Ruckstall were both Mercer drivers, and they won the 2 big races at Tacoma, it shows them making 98 miles an hour on the Planked Speedway. And this was a Mercer advertisement. This is a Peugeot. I love it because it's one of the real action scenes from the race on the board planking. And you can see there's a lot of nasty stuff down in the infield. If you go off there, you wouldn't want to go over the edge of the planking either. It was pretty challenging track. This is Barney Oldfield. He was Henry Ford's favorite race driver, the first driver to run a mile in a minute. He set a whole series of world speed records. He showed up in Tacoma with this monster. This is Christie. Christie had this monstrous V4 front-wheel drive, 300 horsepower car. Barney Oldfield had purchased it from its builder for $750. And using the track at Tacoma, he ran a standing mile at almost 114 miles an hour. And this is a picture of him in Tacoma. You can see the sign behind promoting the Primrose Minstrels at the Vantages. Here's Barney Oldfield and Christie racing one of the flying machines and beating it. He did a whole series of races up and down the West Coast, racing against airplanes and winning. 1916, we had a new winner, driving a Maxwell, some guy named Eddie Rickenbacker. Eddie Rickenbacker was quite a character, of course, and became quite famous later. We'll get to him in a minute. But there was only the one race in Tacoma in 1916. It was a 300-mile race, and Eddie Rickenbacker won it in a Maxwell. That's the winning car. Here's a picture from the board track. I have no idea what the gentleman's drinking in the car. I doubt if it's milk. And I ran 300 miles at an average speed of 89 miles an hour. 89 miles an hour average speed meant they're well over 100 probably on the straightaways. Rickenbacker quit school at age 12 to become a mechanic, and he started as a riding mechanic at age 16. He worked for Duesenberg Brothers, earning $3 a day for a while, and he joined the Maxwell team in 1915. He had a pretty good record for Maxwell. He was managing the team and went to England to see if he could get Sunbeam engines for his Maxwells. Sunbeam had a more sophisticated engine. And while he was in England, he became enamored with the young men flying airplanes and decided if America went to war, he was going to fly for America. And he ended up doing just that. Became a World War I fighter ace, Medal of Honor winner, and later went on to a business career with General Motors and later Eastern Airlines. In 1916, the entertainment consisted of the Summer Military Band, the Fat Man's Ford race, which required entrants to run 100 yards, crank their cars, and make a lap of the track. I have no idea who won the Fat Man's Ford race. They also built a mile of railroad track in the middle of the field, in the middle of the track in the infield, and ran two trains at each other so that the engineers could perform the leap of life. As a matter of fact, the band played Casey Jones right before the locomotives made their collision in the infield. This is Eddie Miller, one of the drivers of the day. And this is my favorite quote from all the quotes I found online and in the newspapers. So I'm gonna read this one because it's great. We ran all those terribly fast tracks with wonderful reliability. I loved that part of racing until the tracks began falling apart. You used to get hit with some terrific blocks and knots of wood. We all came in with pieces of wood bigger than kitchen matches driven into our faces and foreheads. They'd go in, hit a bone, spread out. Then you had to remove them, of course. Tacoma was worse. You had the splinters and the knots and all. But to save on lumber, they spread out the 2x4s and caulked them with some mixture of tar and crushed rock. When Tacoma began to go, it was like a meteor shower. I've seen some pictures of the damage to the tracks after the races, and there were big chunks pulled out of the 2x4s. It must have been amazing to race on. This is a gentleman named Elmer Bergstrom. In 1918, Elmer Bergstrom got on his little Indian motorcycle and ran 24 hours around the 2-mile wooden track in Tacoma to set a world record of 799 miles accomplished. Early in the morning, his crew was worried because he was a little late getting around the track, and he came in shaking because the track had frost on it, and he'd almost lost control on the backstretch. Later on, cows wandered onto the track. Somebody set a small fire to try and keep warm, and it spread to the track. He kept going and said he could have gone longer, but he was real glad it was over. Riding a motorcycle for 24 hours on a board track. Yeah, that's one I'll pass. In 1918, they also had a tractor exhibition. The first Fordson tractors arrived in Washington. The federal government sent 100 tractors to Washington to increase our grain production. And supposedly they raced against cars on the infield. I can find lots of newspaper clippings about them racing against cars, but nothing that explains who won. They also did a plowing demonstration for the local farmers. Here's Earl Cooper in his white Ghost Stutz, Eddie Hearns in a Duesenberg. You can see the tails they put on them for streamlining in 1918, and on the board track in Tacoma. This is Eddie Pullen, who at the time was driving a Mercer. Pretty nice shot because it shows the engine compartment and how crude these race cars were, but neat to see. 1919, they ran 3 races, all of them fairly short, a 40-mile race, 60-mile race, and 80-mile race. And Frontenac's swept the races. This is the promotion advertising that was in the Oregonian at the time for the races, promoting Eddie Rickenbacker came back as a World War I hero to drive the pace car, and Louis Chevrolet was one of the big favorites, and he won one of the races. Frontenac Motor Company built these really interesting cars. This is a hand-tinted black and white picture on the right. Frontenac, excuse me, was a joint venture of Louis and Art and Gaston Chevrolet, and they made this company to build race cars. And they won the Indy 500 in 1920 and 1921. Gaston drove the winning car. He was the youngest of the Chevrolet brothers, drove the winning car at Indy in 1920, and later that year died in a crash. Louis won in Tacoma, and he also designed and built the first Chevrolet passenger car, the Classic 6. Art was an inventor and a tinkerer, and Art Chevrolet's most famous, his big claim to fame was he built a series of race cars that dominated dirt track racing in the 20s, but they were all based on Model T Fords. So it's true, Chevrolet built the Fonte Fords. In 1920, the Tacoma Speedway board track looked like this. They kept that interesting, not quite an oval design when they built the board track. Same design they'd have with the gravel track. Only now it's not a road, so it could have been an oval, but they didn't keep it an oval, which made Tacoma maybe faster than some of the oval tracks. The grandstands are on Steilacoom Boulevard. Trolley car tracks right next to the track, and it was quite the place. In 1920, there were 2 Class A tracks in America. One was the Brickyard in Indianapolis, and the other was the board track in Tacoma. And this is the Tacoma Sunday paper, the automotive section showing the crowned heads of auto racing in their pilgrimage to Tacoma. 225-mile race for a $22,500 purse. Gaston Chevrolet had won the Indy 500. He was a big favorite in 1920, but it was won by Tommy Milton, who did it going nonstop and averaging 95 miles an hour. Back up one. Yeah, okay. This is Ralph De Palma and Pete DiPaolo. They both were Indy 500 winners later, driving a Ballot at Tacoma. Here's Gaston Chevrolet and his Frontenac. And here's the Tacoma Classic race in 1920. This is interesting to me because it shows the covered grandstand. The cars lined up for the start on the track. And also all the Army uniforms down in the pit area. Interesting, the Fort Lewis guys were actually in the pit area to start the race. In 1921, that grandstand had been burned down in 1920, but rebuilt in 21. They had a fundraiser to raise the funds to rebuild the grandstand. And here's a picture of the speedway and for the 1921 race. There was a $25,000 purse. Eddie Rickenbacker, the first Indy 500 winner, Ray Haroon shared the pace car, and Tommy Milton drove 98-mile-an-hour average speed to win the race. The judges' viewing tower in 1921 was on the infield. One of the weird pictures. So a lot of these pictures were taken by a guy named Marvin Bolden, who was a commercial photographer in Tacoma and took a lot of pictures for the track, a lot of pictures for the local businesses. And he took this picture, and it's titled simply The Stimson Child. There's no other information with this picture. This child has been put in a Frontenac and told to smile to the camera. Not really smiling, but that's the way it goes. I suspect this has something to do with C.W. Stimson, the Stimson Logging Company. They own mills in Seattle and a lot of timberland on the Hood Canal area. Not Simpson, but Stimson, and they were quite the local timber business. And this could well be Miss Jean Stimson, C.W. Stimson's daughter. In 1922, Tacoma Speedway had its last race. Barney Oldfield drove the pace car. Here he is in his pace car. And they lined up all the cars behind. And it was a 250-mile race, the last race in Tacoma. And 30,000 fans showed up. The Duesenberg team was there and favored. Here's a publicity photo of the Duesenberg team on the banking. You see the bridge that went over the track to the infield. Duesenberg's 183 was an international race car, actually, 3 valves per cylinder, 115 horsepower. Duesenberg's big advantage was 4-wheel brakes. Hardly anybody else had 4-wheel brakes. Duesenberg put on 4-wheel brakes, and their car could outperform a lot of the others with that. Here's Jimmy Murphy winning the race. This is a Murphy Special. It's a Duesenberg with a Miller engine. Harry Miller was building the best engines of the day, racing engines. And Jimmy Murphy stuffed a Murphy engine into a Duesenberg chassis with the 4-wheel brakes and averaged almost 98 miles an hour over 250 miles. He beat Tommy Milton by all of 6 seconds. It was the best race at Tacoma and unfortunately the last race in Tacoma. Here's the Murphy Special. Again, this is a Duesenberg with a modification to the radiator to make it a little more streamlined. The Murphy Special had the Miller 183. 183 was the standard for the racing engines, both in Europe and at Indianapolis. And this had a ram intake, basically a carburetor on every cylinder to generate 185 horsepower. And Jimmy Murphy. Jimmy Murphy is my favorite character of all these guys. He's born in San Francisco. He lives in the Irish ghetto in San Francisco. His parents run a store, but his mother's killed in the earthquake in 1906. His father has no idea how to raise this 10-year-old kid, hands him off to a cousin who's a fireman in San Francisco, and eventually he ends up living with his mother's brother-in-law in LA. He goes to school in LA. His patron, the people he's living with, they give him a motorcycle to commute to school, and he falls in love with his motorcycle. He takes it apart, he puts it back together, and just a month or so before graduating from high school, he quits to run his own garage. He's working on cars, he's working on motorcycles. He becomes a riding mechanic for people like Ralph De Palma and Eddie Rickenbacker and Peter DiPaolo and Tommy Milton. He gets a lot of experience with the top drivers as a riding mechanic. He joins the Duesenberg team, and in 1921, he goes to the French Grand Prix at Le Mans and wins in a Duesenberg. American driver, American car, winning the French Grand Prix at Le Mans. It's about 46 years later that the next American driving an American car wins a Grand Prix in Europe, and an American driving an American car wins a Grand Prix or wins a race at Le Mans. But that man's Dan Gurney in 1967. Between Murphy and Gurney, nobody accomplishes that feat, an American driving an American car to win a Grand Prix race. And since Dan Gurney, no American has accomplished that feat. Murphy won the 1922 Indy 500. He was the AAA champion in 22 and 24, and unfortunately was killed in a dirt track race in 1924. And here's my little list of all the winners in Tacoma and the cars and speeds. Put this together out of a couple of different books. I think it's relatively accurate. And here's my thank you page to the Lakewood Historical Society. There is a historical marker in Lakewood at the college there on the site of the Speedway to mark the existence of the Great Tacoma Speedway, the board track that's still on that site. At the Historical Society, they have a mock-up of what the track would have looked like with the 2x4s. They have a lot of pictures, a lot of blueprints, and a lot of newspaper articles and promotional materials and other items of interest. So I recommend the Lakewood Historical Society, and hopefully they'll be open again soon.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Jim. I had no idea that racetrack even existed. So, and it's kind of amazing too, considering all of the people and all of the historical events that happened there. So thank you for sharing all of that information. That was wonderful. So we didn't have any questions come through in the Q&A, but in the chat, it was kind of a question and kind of a thought, stream conscious, from Mike Toe. I will go ahead and read it and we can answer it. Just a thought for some perspective while the fascination with races. The following is from the top of his head. 20 years before the races started, cars did really exist. Most of America was still driving horse and buggy. The autos of the time, Model Ts, could do about 35 miles per hour on dirt roads. To go faster, you need to hop on a steam train that probably maybe did 59 miles per hour. So to see cars going from 60 to 90 miles per hour was like watching a Formula One race today. So in regards to like the first part of your question, why the fascination of the races, I think, and I will let you answer this because you picked the topic, Jim, but I didn't even know there was a speedway in Tacoma. So for me, learning about not only that historical structure, but then also about the people who race there is pretty significant.
Well, Henry Ford has the best answer to that question. Henry Ford's always said, the first race happened 5 minutes after the second car was built. As soon as people had automobiles, they wanted to see what they'd do. And so, the fact that this started out as a 5-mile course on county roads is not at all unexpected, because most of the early races happened on roads. I mean, people would see how fast can you go from London to Brighton in England, which is a race that still happens every year for antique cars, but it started first in the 1800s. And so, yeah, and in order to promote automobiles, remember, this is the Tacoma Automobile Association promoted the races. They brought the racers in to promote automobiles and the fact that people could really get around in these things.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We do have another question from Duncan Johnson. So he wants to know, what happened to the board track? Was it torn down, or what happened to it?
Yes, Duncan, unfortunately, the board track was torn down. Now, I met a guy named Glenn Spieth in Tacoma and Lakewood who told me that a lot of the wood went into building houses in Lakewood. I understand that some of the support pieces are still, you can still see them in a barn in Lakewood. The big 4x4s that were used to build some of the grandstand were used to build a barn after that. But the wood went anywhere it could go. So, but some of the wood, according to local legend, is inside the walls of houses in Lakewood.
Interesting. Thank you. Do we have any other questions or any other thoughts from anyone else? Oh, yes, we do. Hi, Renee. Oh, thank you so much. So Renee's question is, you mentioned the hazards from the damage of the boards during the race. Have you found any mention of what tires were preferred or developed to race on this type of track?
No, I haven't. But in fact, some of the stories about people, especially in the local racers, using worn out tires because they thought they'd be faster on the track, and finding out when the splinters hit, they weren't faster because it destroyed the tires. And there are some pretty scary stories of people running off the track and having some pretty serious accidents in those, basically the amateur local races.
Oh, wow. All right, we have another question. Thank you all so much for asking these questions. This is from Eric LeMay to Jim. Have you seen Dr. Herstad's Tacoma Speedway vault?
Hi, Eric. I haven't been in the vault, but I've seen the materials he shared with the Tacoma Historical Society.
Awesome. Anyone else? Any other questions? This is honestly fantastic. I'm so glad that we had such a good discussion and so many folks decided to show up. I know this is a different format than what we're typically used to, but I do appreciate everyone still turning out from home. Okay, we've got another question from Mac. Did they have any other races like Saturday night races?
I don't know about Saturday night races, but they did have other races at the track. There were definitely motorcycle races at the track. I've seen pictures of the motorcycle races. I haven't seen a lot of documentation, but they ran motorcycles and raced motorcycles at the track. I don't think they could have done bicycle racing at the track with those grooves between the 2x4s, but motorcycles and I'm sure there were other local races, but they're not documented. You can find a little documentation about some of the intercity races because the Portland papers and the Seattle papers covered them as far as who won, but you don't see much other documentation. And a lot of that's just lost to history, I think.
Wonderful. Anyone else? Any other questions? Did pretty good on time, so. This will be for, if you know anyone who happened to miss tonight's event, we will be posting the recording up on our website. So you can definitely go on there and rewatch it and share it with your friends, all of those wonderful items. And then our next If Cars Could Talk is going to be on, it is October, I was going to say today. It is going to be on November 10th, and we are actually doing a joint presentation. Renee, our own Renee Christ, will be giving a talk, as well as Harriet Vasquez, and they're going to be talking about fun, weird, local, different transportation items native to the Pacific Northwest and related to what we have in our local collection. So definitely stay tuned for that one. That will also be a very interesting talk. I'd like to thank all of you again very much for coming out on this windy Tuesday night and enjoying you spending time. Hopefully you enjoyed spending your time with us, and for letting Jim talk to us and tell us some new and interesting things about the Tacoma Speedway track. So thank you all again very much. If you have questions or feedback, feel free to email education@americascarmuseum.org. We would love to hear from you. Thank you all so much, and I hope to see all of you again very soon. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful night, everyone.